Kia ora and welcome to our webinar today, a well-designed container deposit return scheme for New Zealand. We'd like to thank you all for making the time to attend and to hopefully extend your knowledge on what an effective, high-performing container return scheme will look like for New Zealand. Let's start with a karakia by Sue. No?
Hey everyone. Yeah, good to see so many of you coming in to have a listen today. And yeah, I've chosen this karakia because it really speaks to knowing and understanding one another, being intentional in our work, staying steady and being respectful. So it's a good fit for today. E te mahi hui, whaia te mātoronga kia mārama. Kia whai taki ngā mahi katoa, tū maia, tū kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou ki katoa.
Thanks, Sue. Kia ora. So, I'm Lucy and I'm the Community Waste Educator at the Seagull Centre in Thames. We have a reasonable sized facility, providing the community with reuse shop and a hard to recycle outlets. Over the last year, our strategic plan has started to shift and we are looking at spreading our wings. We are doing this through a few different ways. One of this is through our Natural Organic Waste Solutions project, using black soldier flies to process food waste destined for landfill. You can find out more on our Facebook page. And the other is to support the Zero Waste Network to advocate for a container return scheme here in New Zealand, which is why we are all here today. For the past 6 months or so, I've been privileged to virtually sit beside 3 of Australasia's CRS experts and learn all the ins and outs of a container return scheme. When I started this process, I was like the most of the general public. Why can't we have one tomorrow? It makes sense, right? Slap 20 cents on a bottle and get it back. So what's the holdup? Luckily for me, our experts have a lot of patience and have been able to answer all of my questions. So hopefully most of your questions will be answered throughout our talk today. So let me introduce the experts to you. First up, we have Polly Brownlee. Polly has worked on product stewardship and waste minimisation for the last 5 years, including previously working on the container return scheme policy and the plastic phase out at the Ministry for the Environment. But lucky for us, she's now working for Zero Waste Network. Then we'll hear from Sue Coutts. Sue has been involved in the resource recovery industry for 25 years. She ran Wastebusters in Wanaka for almost 20 years, which has given her a good understanding of what it takes to run a local recycling centre. Nowadays, she works with the Zero Waste Network to support the development of practical tools that will take us a step closer to a zero waste. And all the way from Australia, we have Kelman. Robbie is the Director of Reloop Pacific and has worked on packaging recovery policies for the past 20 years, including the development of CRS and EPR in Australia, and was contracted to the New Zealand Technical Advisory Group designing the New Zealand Container Return Scheme. So part of my duties today is timekeeper. So if you see a flying clock, this is to let our speakers know time's up. After each speaker, we'll have an opportunity for questions. So please drop any in the Q&A part of the chat and we will get to as many as we can. So with further ado, I'll hand it over to Polly.
Kia ora everyone. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see all of you here. Not that I can see your faces, but I know you're here. Yeah, my name's Polly. I work for Zero Waste Network, advocating for the beverage container return scheme. I thought I'd kick us off by giving us a quick overview of the current situation, the solution, and where are we now. So it's clear that our systems in New Zealand aren't working for beverage containers. We drink about 2.5 billion a year, but less than half of them are collected for recycling, so about 45%. It means that over 1 billion beverages are littered or landfilled every year, which equates to about 4.7 million a day, which in a practical sense means that we see them on our beaches, in our environments, lakes, rivers, all of that, public spaces. So it's not great for the environment, but it's also not good for our wallets, because at the same time, councils and ratepayers are paying and subsidising for litter cleanups, public bins for drink containers, and for our curbside collections. Part of the challenge with beverage containers is that they're consumed out and about while people are on the go and away from home. So our current curbside systems aren't able to fully address this problem. As you can see on the screen, there is about 57 countries and states that have got container return schemes in operation. So they're already operating and they've been going since the 1970s. And there's about 14 more coming online in the next, between now and 2030. So they are a really evidence-based, recognised way to drive beverage container recovery and increase recycling. In New Zealand, advocacy for a container return scheme has been going on for about 25 years, and it's nothing new. Many people will be able to remember a similar thing back in the 70s where they could return their drinks and get a few cents back. So with the CRS, as you all probably know here, consumers pay a refundable deposit like 20 cents when they buy a drink or a drink in a bottle, can or carton, which they get back when they return the empty container for recycling or reuse. At its core, a CRS provides the incentive to encourage people to return their empties to specified collection points for recycling. We want one here in New Zealand because we know that they work, they're popular, and they pay for themselves. They work. Overseas, schemes achieve high collection rates of 85% or more, and they're popular. So in NZ, surveys have consistently shown again and again that Kiwis want this. Not to mention 98% of the public who submitted on the Transforming Recycling consultation and local government that support it too. 96% of mayors voted in favour back in the day. And they pay for themselves, so the real cost of recycling is built into the purchase price of the drink. And the last thing about this that I want to mention is that all the policy development work has been done for this. So about 5 years of policy development, design, analysis, stakeholder engagement, all of that happened. And in late 2022, Cabinet previously agreed to implement it before it was paused. So yeah, so we consider that what was designed and what is currently on the shelf is based on international best practice and would be a good fit for NZ. So where are we at now? Zero Waste Network has been advocating for CRS since the last century, and we've got a few new resources up on our webpage, which you can see, including a 4-page briefing. We're keeping track of latest developments with what's happening overseas, and so you can find all that information on our website. And we'll also be publishing a few fact sheets going into a bit more detail, which we can share after the webinar. And so on the 24th of February, a coalition of 84 companies, councils and non-profits wrote a letter to the government asking them to prioritise a container return scheme. It included the likes of Woolworths, Foodstuffs, Coca-Cola, NZ Beverage Council, 24 councils and lots of Zero Waste Network members. So while we know that the ministry isn't currently considering policy options for a CRS, there's definitely progress on the legislative front. So the revision and update of the primary legislation, so the WMA and the Litter Act, is well underway, and we're expecting a consultation on this in the first half of this year, which we anticipate will set out the extended producer responsibility framework, which is required to enable a CRS. We've also seen in the Ministry for the Environment's work program that mention of that same regulatory framework in the legislation. So I guess looking ahead, we can expect a public consultation soon, which gives us a key opportunity to ensure that the key features of a well-designed scheme are embedded into legislation. So what does a well-designed scheme look like? Lucy, could you go to the next slide? Cool. Okay, so bear with me, a bit of detail there, but basically the design matters and it's really important to get it right from the outset. A well-designed scheme for New Zealand would lead to recovery rates of 85% or more, in line with international best practice. On the screen are the top 10 container return schemes in the world. Just keep in mind that New Zealand's current recovery rates are 45%, so for beverage containers. So these schemes all achieve 87% recovery or more, Germany is the best in the world at 98%. Finland is just below that. Notably, most of these are European, and European schemes average about 87% return rates. But the key takeaways here, what we know from the experience of the 57 countries and schemes operating worldwide, and from looking into these top 10 as well, is that high-performing schemes typically share common traits. They're designed so that they're convenient. That's that first column there. They perform well, and they've got practical targets, checks, and balances. So being designed to be convenient, which is what Sue will talk about soon, it means having a convenient return network with a mix of return locations. And as you can see, most of these schemes include an element of legislated return to retail. To be designed to perform well, it means to have an effective deposit rate, which actually incentivizes returns, and to have a broad scope of containers. And to have effective targets, checks, and balances. Most of these schemes include legislated collection targets. We won't talk about that today. That will be a webinar for the future. But so, yeah, overall, international experience shows that it's the combination of these features which creates high-performing schemes. It's the combination of having convenient scheme, convenient network with these key performance elements. Yeah, so designing it right from the outset is really important. Design it once and get it right, essentially. And the good news is that the container return scheme already drafted by MFE includes these combinations of features, and is based on international best practice. So we consider that it would be a good fit for New Zealand. In the next 2 slides, I will be talking about the performance element here. So the middle columns, I'll talk about the deposit amount and scope of containers, and Sue will then talk about convenience and the return network. Could we go to the next slide, Lucy? Okay, so first up is the refundable deposit. To perform well, we know that container return schemes need to have an effective refundable deposit amount. The primary purpose of the deposit is to incentivize people to return empty drink containers for recycling and reuse. And to actually achieve this in practice, we need to have a deposit that's high enough to incentivize people to pick up containers, whether it's some that they see littered or drop off their own containers, and get that deposit back. So international research consistently shows that the deposit amount has got the greatest impact on return rates. Higher deposits typically lead to a greater participation in recovery. The data on the screen here is from 57 countries and states. And yeah, generally what we can see that as the deposit amount increases, recovery rates increase. This is obviously in conjunction with other features as well, like having a convenient network, but just staying with this for now. So schemes, if we look to the far left of this, we can see that schemes that have got deposit amounts of 10 cents or less generally achieve a median return rate of 70%. Australia sort of sits in this category. So, for example, Australian schemes have got 10-cent deposit amounts and have got return rates of below 70% for the likes of Queensland Act and New South Wales. In contrast, schemes on the upper end in green achieve higher deposits. So European schemes on average range between 13 cents to 73 cents, the upper end. But yeah, we're really wanting to look at that box there in green. So a 20 cent to 27 cent deposit would achieve likely 90% recovery rates. So all in all, we support a 20-cent deposit because it's a stronger incentive for people to return their empties, the stronger incentive for container recovery, reducing litter and improving recycling. A container worth 20 cents is worth more, and it creates a better incentive for people to return the empties. It's expected to achieve those higher recovery rates, and we want to be sitting at that mark there in line with best practice overseas. If we're going to set up a scheme here in New Zealand, we want to be aiming for the good one, a good scheme that is in that bracket. A 20-cent deposit also strikes a balance between ensuring an effective scheme while managing increased costs to consumers. And it also has multiple other benefits too, like additional welfare gains from increased recycling, reduced litter, and avoided landfill costs and emissions. Cool, so that's enough on the deposit amount. Next slide, please, Lucy. So to the scope of containers, another key way to drive high performance in container return schemes is to include a broad scope of beverages and container material types. So including plastic, glass, metal, and liquid paperboard. As you can see, most schemes in the world include these materials, especially plastic, metal, glass. So 98% of the world's schemes include plastic and metal, and 85% include glass. So excluding any of these materials would create an unequal playing field for different industries and would increase the cost of the system and make the CRS less effective overall. Overall, we support including these materials because including all of these materials creates an easy to understand scheme for Kiwis to use and participate in. New Zealanders support a broad scope of containers being included too. And it's aligned with international best practice. And it's also about beverage producers taking responsibility for their packaging and ensuring that more beverage containers are collected and recycled for each of these materials, and increasing the recovery rates across all of them. So to wrap up my section, to drive high performance, a container return scheme for New Zealand would need to have a refundable deposit of 20 cents and include a broad scope of beverages and container material types to make it simple, easy to understand, and easy to participate in. Happy to pass back to Lucy now and take any Q&A. Hope that wasn't too much of a quick whirlwind, but to digest there. But yeah, passing back to you, Lucy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Polly. So don't have any questions. Oh, we've got one. What is an example of a refillable container, please? What would be included when would we look at doing refills and reusable containers, Polly, or would this not be something that we'd kind of touch on? And if we would, what would it be? What would it look like?
Sure. So we would advocate for refillables to be able to opt in to the CRS. So an example of refillable containers are like you can have refillable glass containers that can be refilled by the producer and then washed, sterilized, returned. It's got their own back-end system, but they share the same front end of the system. So basically, yes, we would want reuse to be able to opt in to the network. We would also ideally want the product stewardship organization to be able to support refillables too. So, for example, some unredeemed deposits could potentially go to setting up more infrastructure to support the back-end reverse logistics for reuse and refill. But also at its core, a CRS starts to level the playing field because it starts to internalize the costs of single-use packaging. So internalizing those costs of the environmental costs of single-use packaging starts to level the playing field a little bit between single-use and reuse, but we do need to ensure that there's incentives and targets and other areas carved out for reuse. And we'll be including we've got a fact sheet which we're writing up, which will have more information on that.
Great, thank you. A few more questions coming through for you, Polly. One about how clean do bottles need to be when they're put into the machine? So do we need to have a water tap next to it so all bottles are rinsed out before they go in, or is it not quite that bad at this stage?
No, my understanding, I mean, obviously you wouldn't want it to be really dirty, just like normal recycling, but with beverages it's different. It's not like with a hummus container, there's a lot of hummus on it, and that's really bad contamination, and you definitely need to rinse that out first. But with beverage containers, if it's just a small amount of residue, like fizzy drinks or something like that, then it should be fine from my understanding. Yeah, it's different. Yes, yeah, sorry, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Awesome. And one other question that's come through, we're talking beverages. So are we talking milk bottles as well?
Yes, so the previous design that was landed on was to exempt fresh milk because there's high recovery rates of fresh milk at curbside recycling anyway, and milk is typically consumed at home. It's not consumed out and about and on the go, but we would advocate to include fresh milk just to make it really simple, easy to understand for consumers. There's no real reason to exempt fresh milk. Lots of schemes around the world include it, and also excluding or exempting fresh milk, just like with other products or container materials, would create an unlevel playing field. So it basically gives a bit of a free pass to certain producers. Yeah, so we would advocate to include it.
Fantastic. We've got a few more minutes, so we've got a couple more questions. Is there a size limit of the containers that would come through, or can we just put anything in?
Yeah, the size limit is typically, so overseas it's typically it's up to 3 litres, and it would be the same here. I think that it's about 150 mils to up to 3 litres. Yeah, that's the standard size limit. So really small pouches, things like pouches wouldn't be included because they're not they're not an accepted container material anyway. It's really plastic, metal, glass, and liquid paperboard. And in the plastic category, it's PET, HDPE, and PP. So really small things like pouches wouldn't be included.
Fantastic. And probably our last question for you, Polly, at the moment is, do any of the other successful overseas schemes include wine bottles and alcohol bottles?
Yeah, so most schemes include glass. 85% of the world schemes include glass, and that obviously also includes things like wine and liquor, alcohol. And yes, we'd definitely be wanting to include that in New Zealand's scheme, especially because the glass market is so huge here in New Zealand. Glass is the most common beverage container material sold, and it's also really commonly littered. Glass accounts for a huge amount of litter in New Zealand, and so yeah, including in the scheme would help to collect more. We've also got relatively low recovery rates of glass. Yes, so we would definitely want glass, and yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Polly. So there's a few other questions, and please don't worry, we'll get through as many as we can, but some of them will be answered with Sue, who's going to speak to us next. So I'll hand it over to Sue.
Okay, so it's good to remember that the real reason that we want a container deposit return scheme in New Zealand is because it's a proven method for achieving a 90% return rate. All the other benefits that we're looking for flow from getting almost all the empty drink containers back. So that's good for consumers because they can have confidence that the recycling system works and that their efforts make a difference. It's really great for producers because they can back their brand, meet their customers' expectations, and they can also get access to new containers with recycled content. It's good for recyclers who can tap into clean streams of raw materials to include as that recycled content. And it's great for our ecosystems and environment with less pressure from waste, litter, and pollution. So it's going to take everybody to get to 90%. People need to be excited about it. And to get to good return rates, we need almost everybody to return their empty drink containers. So as Polly said, the system needs to be really clear and easy to understand. It has to feel worthwhile for people, and it's got to be easy to find and get to a return point. The best way to keep cost of living impact down from a CRS scheme is to make sure that everyone that buys a drink and pays a deposit is able to claim their deposit. And what that looks like in the real world is having access to a drop-off. Like you can see a range of those on the screen, different ways you could bring your containers back so that you can return your container and get your deposit back. So in container deposit return scheme language, this is called a convenient return network. Can you click over, Lucy? So the simplest way to think about a convenient return network is how many return points there are per head of population. And as you can see around the world, there's a pretty wide range. In that top 10% that Polly was talking about, they have a return rate of 92%, and their return network is pretty dense, 1 to every 2,000 people. Somewhere like Norway has a lot of return points, so they've got like 15,000, but most containers, about 93%, come back through a quarter of those drop-off points. In New Zealand, where the proposal, which is aiming for 85 and 90% return rate, we're trying to hit the sweet spot between a really convenient return network supported by a reasonable deposit of 20 cents. So those two things in combination will work together to deliver that high return rate. In Australia, you can see that there's not only is there a lot less depots per person or a lot less drop-off points per person, but there's a lower return rate. So the older schemes in South Australia and Northern Territory sitting around 75 to 80%. A lot of the newer schemes in Australia in the 60s, sort of 63 to 68%. And then if you look at a place like California, obviously it's pretty hard to find a return drop-off point there. It has really slipped down the rankings over the last few years because it had a much more convenient network in the past, but it's lost a lot of drop-off sites due to issues with the payments arrangements for depot operators. And so that they're no longer viable and a lot of people have pulled out. The question for New Zealand then is, how do we get this really convenient network that'll deliver us 90% here in New Zealand without breaking the bank? And there's two main strategies for establishing your network. What's being proposed here is a mixed model that tries to get the best out of both worlds. So the model on the table has the ability to procure a network of depots or local drop-off sites that builds on the existing recycling and resource recovery system. And then that's underpinned by a requirement for shops that sell a lot of drinks, like supermarkets, to provide return points where people can take back their empty bottles, cans, and cartons. And these will be right across the country. And that's called Return to Retail. Yep, can you click over, Lucy? So when you think about convenience, there's really two sides to it. Let's look at the return network from the perspective of the people that are using it. What does a mixed model look like to them? For households and individuals, it makes sense to go, say, and drop off your containers at your local supermarket. There's about 680 of these around the country. Most people go there already, and you'll be taking away a load of shopping, so it's pretty practical to bring last week's empties in and then to take your shopping back home. Supermarkets are already placed in an optimal location because they set them up to have access to lots of customers. About 89% of New Zealanders live within 5K of a supermarket and 95% live within 10K. Consumer can choose to donate their containers to a local fundraiser. So that could look like a drop-off point at your local school or marae. They're already places that people go often. So you drop off your containers and they claim the deposit to spend on projects and equipment. Your school or marae would either drop their containers off to a local recycle centre or a depot, or they'd book a collection service to gather them up for them. Could be at a surf club. So say you go to the beach for the day with the family, you could drop your empties off to the surf club, and that way they could raise the funds they need to keep them going so they're there to rescue you in the future, should you happen to need it. If you're thinking about, local recycle centre, then they really make sense if you've had a wedding or a party and you've got a trailer load of bottles, cans, or cartons. The easiest place that'd be the easiest place to drop them off, where you can drive right up and you can unload quickly and easily. A lot of people already make a regular trip to their local recycle centre, so it wouldn't be an additional journey. A place like Wastebusters in Wanaka has 350 or more customer transactions every day, so that's about 45 people coming through an hour, and they already handle about 3 million empty drink containers every year. So it's a reasonable ask to be able to have these sites running as container return drop-off centres. For a business, say, that has a lot of empties, might be in the hospitality sector with running venues or a bar or restaurant, cafe, could be holiday parks or accommodation, then they'd either drop off at a local recycle centre or a depot, or they'd book a collection service. And then you'd have large-scale depots, which are big commercial facilities that mainly receive bulk loads, and your household would really only use that if it's right in your neighbourhood. Yeah, click over. So on the other side of the question, you've got this challenge of how do you create this convenient network of drop-off sites? To us, it makes a lot of sense to integrate the drop-off points with the infrastructure that we already have. There's been an ongoing discussion in New Zealand about how to modernise and upgrade our infrastructure so we can increase reuse and recycling. And the government's waste and resource efficiency strategy that's just been released has cost-effective outcomes-focused investment as a key part of that. The idea of a mixed model was really well supported in the 2022 consultation. About something like 86% of respondents were in favour of including both return to retail alongside and a network of local depots. And the idea behind that is that we can have the best of both worlds. So return to retail makes it easy for people to fit it into their daily lives, and there's a solid base layer of return points spread across the country. A network of depots gives you the flexibility to handle bulk flows, do collections, and it gives you the potential to act as a drop-off point for lots of different kinds of products going to reuse and recycling. So you could drop off your e-waste, your reusables, and your containers all at the same time. So why would these organisations want to take part? There's two main motivations. One of them is access to foot traffic. So it brings customers into your business or your organisation. So supermarkets, people often will spend their deposits. If they bring them back to the store, then they'll spend their deposits when they go shopping afterwards. And it creates a revenue stream to cover the cost of the work. So the scheme, one of the critical elements of the scheme is that it really has to cover the real cost of handling the containers. Fundraisers like schools or Mariah get to claim their deposits, and that's how it's valuable to them. But retailers, recycling centres, and depot operators would get paid a handling fee. So if we start with return to retail, the method that you use to get retailers to participate is to use legislation to create an obligation in return for giving them an opportunity. So in order to be able to carry on selling a large number of drinks to everybody, you would need to provide a drop-off point to collect the empties. Supermarkets put about 50% of the drinks on the market. So in 2021, that looked like about 1.4 billion bottles, cans and cartons. Most New Zealanders have great access to a supermarket, as we've already said, they're close by. And one of the things that we noticed in the consultation process was that large retailers who submitted weren't so keen on this idea. And really that's because they'd have to internalise a cost that's been paid for by somebody else so far. We think it's entirely reasonable to expect that they'd be a key part of the return network since they're putting half the bottles out into the market. The retailer said it wouldn't be necessary to regulate them because they would participate voluntarily. And I guess it's, that's not supported by the international evidence. We see in Western Australia, return to retail is enabled, but it's voluntary, and there's very little return to retail has come to pass over there. So commercial operators in the hospitality sector, say bars, restaurants, cafes, events, they sell a lot of drinks that get consumed on site. Doesn't really make sense to require them to take back bottles, cans and cartons that were sold by somebody else, but it really does make sense to require them to separate out the bottles, cans and cartons that they've sold to the punters that are on their site and to either return them to a drop-off or use a collection service. And we can also build on the existing resource recovery network. So we've got a network of reuse and recycling centres around the country that accept a wide range of end-of-life products and materials already. They could receive bulk loads of containers from households, fundraisers and businesses, and they could offer collection services to fundraisers and businesses. There's provision in the current proposal to run a procurement at the big, by the managing agency that's set up to look after the scheme would run a procurement process, and people could opt in and bid for the opportunity to be one of these sites. They could be small, which they'd have maybe 500,000 to 1 million containers passing through. Could be a medium size. So already talked about somewhere like Wastebusters or Extreme Zero Waste, which a lot of you will be familiar with. They're handling between 2 and 5 million containers a year. And then there could be large industrial commercial facilities where there's 6 to 25 million containers coming through. And one of the benefits of including these multi-purpose reuse and recycling centres in the network is to really drive change over time. If you think about it, when you're taking your bottles, cans and cartons back to the supermarket, you're basically maintaining status quo. You buy a drink in a single-use container, you bring back the empty and use the deposit money to buy another one. And when you go to a reuse and recycling centre, there's a whole world of possibility that opens up, and you have access to a whole range of new services that are probably going to change your life. Yeah, and shift you towards more of a zero waste lifestyle or zero waste business model. So that's about it from me. I'll pass back to Lucy, who's keeping track of all those questions.
Great, thanks, Sue. We do have a few. I know they'll start coming in more as well now that you've stopped. So one of our questions was, if our return rate is 90% or target return rate is 90%, what happens to the money that's the deposits of that 10% that's not collected? What do we use them? And how do we make sure that our return rate stays high so that that amount of money doesn't kind of just keep increasing?
What happens generally in the good schemes around the world is that the producer will pay a deposit on every bottle or can that gets put into the market. And so if you're not recovering 100%, then there'll be a little pot of cash in there to be able to spend on developing the scheme, marketing, setting up new facilities, making sure that everything's working really well. So those are called the unredeemed deposits. To begin with, that could be a reasonably large pot of cash, and that's useful to have in the early days because that's the time where you're really developing your network and putting a lot of energy into getting everybody on board. As your return rate increases quickly, then the pot of cash becomes a bit smaller, and you can use that money to either subsidize cost of recycling, so that might go in to help cover the cost of the scheme itself, so that producers have to put in a bit less in order to cover the real cost of recycling, or you can use it for development and promotion. One of the things that would be a really great idea to use it for is to invest in the refillables network. So being able to really, if you've got a little bit of cash left over, like, you get to 90%, you can use that to really invest in building up the capacity across the country to accept and look after refillables. So that would be a critical part of it. And then I guess that if we have a really high return rate, then we don't have the pot of cash isn't getting big very fast. So, that's one of the fears that's often a concern. The second part of the question was about how do we keep people motivated? And I think what we've seen around the world is evidence that over time, the deposit amount gets eroded by inflation. So some of the schemes in the early days that was set up with a 5-cent deposit, like say Oregon, at a 5-cent deposit, kind of became not really worth it. People like, nah, not really worth it for 5 cents. But so they have increased their deposit rate, and then their scheme is really kicked back onto track. We can have triggers in the system, in the regulations or the legislation, the regulations, to say that if the scheme is not achieving a certain return rate, then the deposit rate will automatically increase, and that will give everyone a boost and get them back on track again.
Awesome, thank you. One of our most important questions, what happens with a box of beers? Is it 20 cents for the box, or is it 20 cents per bottle in the box?
It's 20 cents per bottle inside the box. So, the first time you go to the shop when this comes in, it's going to be a bit of a hit. But the great thing is you take your bottles back the next week when you go back, or the next, month when you go back if you're a slow drinker, and you get that deposit back, so you can spend it on the next box you buy. So it's really a one-off cost.
Yeah. Awesome, thanks, Sue. And one more. Oh, sorry, Polly, go.
Just wanted to add, so, and it relates to another question that's been put in the chat too, in terms of how is this whole thing funded. So there's the refundable deposit, which is the 20 cent on each beverage, as Sue was just saying, plus there's the additional scheme fee, which is a few cents per container too. And so the assumption is that that would be passed through to the purchase price, 100% passed through, but the reality might be different. But essentially, it'll be 20-cent deposit plus a few cent scheme fee. And the scheme fee, it's also called a producer fee overseas, that covers the whole cost of collection, recycling, and making sure that the containers are actually recycled containers to containers. So yeah, that's a critical part of the system as well. So just wanted to clarify that. Back to you, Lucy.
Cool. I'm just keeping an eye on time, so we might move to Robbie, and then we can come back to some of these questions if we need to. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Robbie.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to give you a view over the ditch of what we have in Australia. We've got every state and territory in Australia has a scheme. Where I live in Tassie, the scheme will start on the 1st of May. So a bit late, but nevertheless. So all the schemes are harmonised at 10 cents. A very similar scope of containers. Wine is mostly excluded, although Queensland has said that they will introduce, or they've started to introduce wine in glass bottles. We have aluminium, glass, PET, liquid paperboard, etc. Generally, either 50 ml or 150 ml up to 3 litres is the sort of size. White milk is excluded in Australia. Flavoured milks are included. There's no retail mandate. That's important. I'll probably come into that in a minute. And the governance regimes as to how they're actually run vary. There's 2 basic models. One is a single scheme coordinator that runs the whole thing. That's WA and Queensland primarily. And the other states and territories largely have a network operator model. Without going into a whole lot of detail, I'm happy to take questions offline around those models. But basically, the New South Wales, Victoria, Tassie ACT scheme takes the obligation away from the scheme coordinator, who's generally the beverage industry, for determining the network of collection points, and that's really the government decides the collection network. So look, they have been massively successful in the first instance. So there's a couple of states that did bin audits prior to the scheme starting, and they basically concluded that the recycling rate for these eligible beverage containers was around about 32%. Anyway, that you basically curbside kind of audits pre-scheme commencement. Now the recycling rate's around a bit over 65, 67%, something like that, and 40% litter reductions in terms of eligible containers. So obviously they've been successful, but I've basically been put here by my colleagues to as a sort of a warning chapter in the narrative, which is that Australian schemes are pretty much like amongst the worst in the world, unfortunately. So highly successful, but at the same time, extremely limited. The reason for the limitations are 10 cents is increasingly meaningless to consumers. And that's why we are hovering at the sort of late 60%, but it's really stagnated, and it is likely to sort of drop away. And, you know, you see this with sort of really low refund value or deposit value schemes around the world, like, you know, New York and, you know, California and these sort of places, which get very low return rates. I mean, you know, the deposit amount in Germany is 25 euro cents. So it's like 40 Australian cents, maybe 42, 43 New Zealand cents, right? So it's a really meaningful deposit and refund. So something that you really want to sort of chase. There's a policy debate here around increasing the refund value, 20 cent plus. You'd want 20 cents to start with a mechanism to keep up with inflation. Otherwise, we have to prosecute this kind of ridiculous conversation every 5 or 10 years to get it up again. And it is, unfortunately, it is a laborious kind of re-go at the whole thing when you're trying to get an increased refund, because the vested interests, of course, don't want to see higher return rates, and a higher refund is a critical measure to get higher return rates. As I say, there is revised scope. We think most states will include wine bottles. They were excluded because South Australia, which is a big wine state, excluded wine back in the 70s when the refillable return schemes fell away and South Australia kept its single-use scheme. So it's, again, been a bit of a battle to get wine included. A beer and other other drinks in glass are already included, but wine hasn't been. So, and the collection network across Australia is mostly pretty inconvenient, and I can go into that in a bit more detail. Lucy. So just to give a quick overview, and Sue and Polly looked at this as well, you know, this return rate there's a bit of a confusing slide. Basically, this is showing the refund value, and there are variable refund values in different states. And then the little dots across the top show you the return rate. So you can see where there's a higher refund value, you generally get a higher return rate. Yeah. Lucy, give me another slide. So I'll just sort of focus in here just quickly on, and this has been touched on. We have both a lack of quality and a lack of quantity in terms of collection points in Australia. So most of Europe have this return to retail mandate. Again, it's been touched on. Most EPR, extended producer responsibility schemes, obligate producers of the product and the sellers of the product to be involved in some kind of return program. And it's the same across Europe. Unfortunately, in Australia, literally what happened, because I was sort of around, was ministers at the time went, oh my God, we're going to have a massive fight with Coke and Lion and all these others who don't want these schemes. And that's enough of a political problem for us, without then having a massive fight with Coles and Woolies, who are sort of enormous here as well, as retailers are in New Zealand. So they sort of squibbed on requiring retailers to set up take-back facilities, which is completely common across really the best performing schemes. So again, what you see in Norway is not only huge numbers of sites, but they're super convenient, right? There are, as Sue said, they are at places where you sort of naturally go. So, you know, Norway, an obligation on retailers over a certain size to take back containers. So they set up facilities. The number of collection points per head of population is 1 per 370 people. Now, if you drop down to Queensland, which is mostly a sort of depot-based model, it's 1 collection point per 15,500 people. Now, in some areas of Queensland, it's 1 per 30,000 people. Like down in southeast Queensland, it's pretty poor. And again, the collection facilities are sort of back of industrial estates, which have a role, you know, for facilitating larger quantities, but for your day-to-day kind of consumer. And I think there's also an equity argument here for, you know, day-to-day consumer who can only have time to sort of go and get their money back on a sort of Saturday morning or whatever. They're going to want to do the soccer run and go to sort of some sort of out-of-town facility to sort of get their $2 or $3. We find that they don't. So having a more convenient return network would be super important. Now, we do have some level of retail engagement. Sue mentioned this, but it's voluntary. So it's pretty patchy. It's just not as effective. It's mostly in car parks of supermarkets rather than in store, etc. So obviously that's something that really needs to improve. And Lucy, have I got one more slide?
Yes.
So just very quickly, there is a conversation about improving the schemes. There is a regulatory process underway to look at a higher refund value. It's a bit stagnated, trying to get it pushed along. And the Queensland government a month or two ago actually announced that they're doing a complete parliamentary inquiry into the Queensland scheme because of its underperformance. So they're looking at the poor collection network, and the low refund value and the governance framework and a whole range of things. So we're making submissions to that at the moment, which is great that a government's actually stood up and said, look, we feel like our scheme is pretty average at best. You know, we want to have a good look at it. So as part of the regulatory process, the heads of the EPAs in each of the states have done consumer analysis. And I'm just pointing out the top line items that come up as complaints, if you like, from consumers. And if you look at New South Wales, the biggest item is it's hard to get to points, and the refund amount is also hard, is also low. ACT, you can see 38 and 31%. Queensland actually says that the refund amount is their biggest challenge, and that the second biggest is that it's the collection network is inconvenient. So that's just, you know, some of these two features, inconvenient network and low refund value, are the critical features for consumers. So thanks. I think I went a minute over.
I think you did, but we'll forgive you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Awesome. Thanks, Robbie. I think some questions will come in for you in particular in a minute, Robbie, but we'll just start with one that probably can hand back to anyone. Do we have the means to recycle all of this extra collected material, or will we be shipping it offshore?
Do you want me to touch on that, Polly? Well, let me just say something just very quickly about that. Polly will go into the New Zealand situation a lot better than I will, obviously. But Australia does export some material. I mean, we export, I think all of the aluminium goes offshore for reprocessing into new cans because we don't have aluminium sheeting production. So, you know, I mean, I suppose Australia's and New Zealand's very export dependent economies. I don't really have a sort of a position against exports if that's what has to happen to some material. What you're going to get, of course, with some glass is you might get some downcycling if the furnaces can't take all the material. Look, let's remember, these schemes are at least partly about litter reductions. So I think it's a great thing if we can get 100% of this material out of the environment, 100% back into bottle-to-bottle recycling if we can. And if there's some remnant material, at least it's not in landfill and it's have some secondary use and it's not left on the beach.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Robbie.
And I'd add to that with New Zealand, so I think there was another question about what about all the different material types of their markets onshore. So I guess it's the same question, but yes, for most of them, you know, liquid paperboard, definitely markets onshore need to provide the collection means to collect more of that across the country. Same with plastic, the PET, HDP, and PP, especially PET and HDP, which is what a lot of the beverage containers are made from. They're high value materials, and so if we had more collections of that would help to feed our onshore plastic reprocessing capacity. So it would help to feed into that. And with metal, obviously, a lot of that, as Robbie was saying, may be sent offshore, but aluminium is a high quality, circular, high value product. So yeah, I agree in terms of so long as there is circular solutions, which is what would be included in the legislation. From my understanding, there would be a requirement for the materials to, where possible, have a circular food grade recyclable solution. And with glass, if there is, with the oversupply in New Zealand, there's that we should still be collecting as much as we can. Our recovery rates are relatively low, so there's ways to address the oversupply of glass. The scheme could include recycled content targets to require more of that, or explore alternative end markets. Some of those could be offshore, like in Australia possibly, or an eco-modulation fee could be included as well to help to shift. If there was an eco-modulation fee which incentivized reuse and refill, then that would help to shift away from single-use glass towards refillable glass too, potentially. So there are just some options in there that could be explored. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll just throw in my 2 cents worth. I think the critical issue for exports is quality. Like the reason that it became uncomfortable for New Zealand around our recycling with National Sword was that we were sending some pretty poor quality material offshore, and that was embarrassing and made us all feel bad. But there's no reason why we can't export really great quality recycling to another country for it to be reprocessed. And I think, you know, it's no different as an export to meat or wool or any of the other things that we make and sell. And we just have to be really confident that it's good quality product we're baling up and sending away. And with container return scheme, you're guaranteed good quality. So that's a really good side of the container return story.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got lots of questions on the chat, but we're running out of time. So I'm just going to ask a couple of really easy kind of questions. So not all of us are tech savvy, including myself. Do I have to have an app for this, or do we can get some coins, like the kids can collect a bottle and get 20 cents, go to the shop? Like, is it that simple?
It's both. You get your refunds in cash, or there could be store vouchers, or an app. There would be a range of different return options involved.
That's awesome. Thanks. And my last thing is, so what do we do now, Polly? Where's the go-to for our supporters today? What do they need to do from here?
Okay, well, so I think one of the key things is, I mean, it's been a few years since the work has paused on this, but now we're waiting for the legislation to come out, which hopefully will provide a little bit more information about what the overall framework will look like. So I think just really refreshing yourselves and thinking about what it means for you and your organization, what is a good scheme, just kind of revisiting some of that content to be prepared for any public consultation that might come out. And we've got some resources up on our website through Zero Waste Network, which you can find, including the fact sheets, which we will put up soon. So I guess that would be a key thing. And another key point would be we will be sharing things on social media, and so if anyone wants to be involved in that, you could like and share and comment and just sort of show that it's still, create the momentum that it's still a thing and we're still all thinking about it and we want it to happen. We've just got to kind of keep working away on this. We just really want to keep the momentum up.
Fantastic. All good. Cool. So we might leave it there, and we will say thank you to everybody. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being supportive of the container return scheme and being with us on this journey. So we will let you go back to your busy day. But before we do, I just want to say thank you to our experts. I know you've all spent countless time going through research from around the world, talking with important people, and writing lots of documents, because they tell me all the time they have no idea what they're saying, but apparently it's very important. So we know that you're doing your best to create a world-class CRS for New Zealand, and we thank you for that. So we'll finish up today with a closing karakia from Sue. Is it on the slide, Sue?
Yeah. No, not yet. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I really appreciate that, and good to have Robbie's support as well from across the ditch and to be able to hear all the stories from over there. So this is a good karakia for us to close out on, because as we go back into the world, it reminds us to appreciate and care for our world around us and for all those people in it. Aio ki te rangi, aio ki te whenua, aio ki ngā mea katoa, tihe Māori ora.
Awesome. Thanks, Sue. So that's us for today. We'll have some more webinars coming up in the future, so keep an eye on the Zero Waste Network website. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Ka kite.